Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the International Institute. And on behalf of the Institute and all of its centers and the staff and faculty who work at the centers, I want to welcome you. For our out-of-town visitors, I want to welcome you to Ann Arbor. We had a beautiful day yesterday and a not so beautiful day today, but we'll make it through. And this is a wonderful day and event, and I know the way it works here at the University of Michigan. There's such a rich intellectual environment. There's a lot of other things going on. People will come in and out all day, faculty. But we are delighted to have our visitors here from out of town, and we're also delighted to have such a quality program from top to bottom in terms of the U of M faculty who are participating and also our guests. This event, Translating Human Rights, Bodies of Evidence, is part of the Translation Theme Semester that is being run by the Department of Comparative Literature. And I want to note that the organizing committee, I've been delighted to work with the fellow members of that. Two of them are from the Department of Comparative Literature, Yopi Prinz and Christy Merrill, and then Pam Ballinger from the Department of History. It's been a pleasure working with them, and I think it's safe to say that they have been the main intellectual presence on the committee. It's not my area of interest, but I am tremendously interested in this topic today and being here. I'm going to soak it in. I'm going to be a consumer of this, and I look forward to it. It's obviously a very serious and important topic, but it's also one that benefits, that is, the consumers of this field benefit from interdisciplinary focus, and that is why we're here. That's why this institute and a unit like CompLit is so appropriate for this event, bringing together people across disciplines, across fields of study, parts of the world that they study, and so forth. I have a few people to thank, and then I'll turn it over to to Christy and Pam. I want to thank specifically certain staff members in the International Institute for their wonderful work on this. Marilyn Giguere and Pat Lord, Suzanne Kosis, Bill Bingham, Michael Farquharson. Also, work studies, Deanna, Liz, Annie, and Erica were all terrific in making this possible. And the support of the center staff generally, the staff of the centers in the II who assisted in the marketing and organization of this. I really appreciate their help. I want to thank them directly and personally. So I will step out of the way, and again, I'm going to go sit down and soak this in and enjoy it. Let me turn the podium over to two of the co-organizers. You're going to start, right, Christy? Okay. So I'll just introduce both of them. First, it will be Christy Merrill, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Associate Professor of Asian Languages and Cultures. And the second person after Christy is Pam Ballinger, part of the organizing team. She's the Fred Cooney Professor of History of Human Rights and Associate Professor of History. So welcome, Christy.
So I'd like to echo Ken's words of thanks and welcome. As both co-director with Yopi Prinz of the Translation Theme Semester, I'm giving you a little glimpse of the website, and as one of the co-organizers of this event. I'm just going to go to here. Seem to be working. Okay. I should explain, especially for the out-of-town guests, what a theme semester is. Each semester, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts selects a theme. Last semester was language, now we're in translation. Next semester, race. That fosters collaborations and conversations across disciplines. The deans designate a small team of interested faculty to organize college-wide events that bring students, staff, and faculty together, not only to highlight cross-departmental intellectual strengths of the college, but also to foster new perspectives on these themes. As you can see from our website, we have defined our theme of translation broadly so that it includes but is not limited to exchange between languages and also between, quote, media, cultures, and disciplines. We've been especially focused on making visible the daily encounters we often have that are mediated through translation, and then on reflecting on that process. You'll see that the discussion today definitely shares these emphases, and I'd like to take a few minutes explaining the thinking that has gone into organizing today's event. Yopi and I were excited and deeply appreciative when Ken offered to dedicate the International Institute's annual symposium to a topic related to the translation theme semester. Not only would it allow us to highlight the international aspect of translation that is so fundamental to what we do as comparative literature scholars, but it would also allow us to bring in the interdisciplinary nature of the questions we think translation necessarily raises and that are particularly important to this theme semester. We decided to focus on translating human rights in particular because it's something that I have been increasingly involved in researching and teaching, most prominently as a human rights fellow last year. This is a program run through the International Institute Center for Comparative International Studies that selects faculty from a pool of candidates across the university actively engaged in human rights research and asks them to give one public lecture and to teach an upper-level undergraduate seminar. 5 of our respondents today are past and present human rights fellows: Andrew Herscher, Nancy Rose Hunt, David Porter, Kyo Tatsui, and Susan Waltz. The course I developed, of which I'm teaching another version next semester, is called, not coincidentally, Translating Human Rights. It is a literature seminar focused on reading personal experiences of systemic discrimination in translation. As I say in the course description, I ask students to investigate how key concepts such as literature, human rights, and translation differ across languages and cultures. I ask students to spend the majority of the term exploring the dilemmas translators face when asked to interpret tales of suffering in local languages and represent them in the general, even universal terms English speakers will readily apprehend. Students blog each week about the readings and then for their final project select posts to revise and edit to become part of a class website that aims to offer critical commentary on contemporary literary work and translation, highlighting issues of human rights. By design, the aims of the course align nicely with the aims of this symposium. For both, the assumption is that an attentiveness to the specific intricacies of translation necessarily engage us in larger questions about the epistemological hierarchies operating in the arenas where these issues are negotiated. This is certainly the approach that has animated the organization of the symposium and is one we wanted to spend a moment this morning outlining in more detail. How does the focus on translation help us reframe current debates in the study of human rights? We might consider the historical example of sati, often glossed as widow's sacrifice or self-immolation, that continues to be a lightning rod for discussion in both academic and non-academic settings. This because, as Gayatri Spivak and others have pointed out, the practice is exceedingly contentious and puts those of us poised to condemn it in the morally awkward position of mimicking British colonial officials who officially banned the right in 1829. In many of my classes and in much of my work on the subject of late, I have been asking a version of the question Inderpal Grail will be posing today as well: how to avoid re-engaging in the triangle Spivak characterizes as white men saving brown women from brown men. I know in one of my classes, an international studies student took this charge seriously beyond the essentialist rhetoric and wondered how she, as a Bangladeshi American feminist, might do good work while avoiding the white man's burden moral superiority of this triangle. In our class discussions, the issue of translation came up when trying to sort out the complicated alliances one forms in making such a decision, not only when debating what constitutes legal personhood and will. A sati in colonial India was legal if the widow testified to being willing, but also questions of translation as interlingual transfer we face today when discussing an issue like sati. Translating the Hindi phrase sati ho gayi as become sati versus committed sati, for example, already conveys one's ideological orientation and judging it as a sacred act of turning into a goddess or as a horrific suicide, to quote a witness in an 1857 autobiography. Translation allows us to focus on these details as we point to the details we point to as evidence from our different disciplinary perspectives. I used this example to raise similar questions at my Human Rights Fellowship lecture last February, where I compared this with the moral quandaries I faced when translating Dalit literature that protests against the system of intouchability. I refer to this in part to explain that I met Pam Ballinger at that talk when she asked an exceedingly interesting and productive set of questions in response, despite or because of our disciplinary differences. I say this not only to introduce Pam, but to thank her publicly and profusely for agreeing to collaborate on organizing the symposium, and also to say that I hope today will likewise generate productive engagement across disciplines.
Good morning. Well, let me reiterate Christy's words of thanks and welcome to everyone, and particular thanks to the sponsors of the event, to my co-organizers, to the participants, particularly those who've traveled from far away, as far away as the West Coast, and to everyone for coming out this morning. So as Christy's just said, when we began to put this event together, we were trying to bring together the issue of human rights and translation in provocative and productive ways that would also focus attention on the question of translation and dialogue across disciplinary domains, as well as between the spheres of academic scholarship and, excuse me, on human rights and human rights practice, applied human rights. So we decided upon the theme of bodies of evidence precisely because it was open-ended, at the same time that it gestured towards a series of questions that prove critical for the studies of human rights and translation, really about what constitutes evidence and then how we translate between realms of evidence and types of evidence. So at the heart of various bodies of evidence, which may compete or overlap or complement one another, sits the human body, of course, whose dignity, sanctity, and integrity is the bedrock upon which human rights rest. In excavating the genealogies of both human rights and humanitarianism, historians like Lynn Hunt and Norman Fearing link these phenomena' development to changing ideas of the body. As bodies became increasingly individuated and disciplined through new rules about civility and politeness, so this is Norbert Elias's civilizing process on the one hand, and as public tolerance for torture and capital punishment declined on the other. Yet as these comments suggest, such understandings of the body are not only specific to the late 18th century, but also to particular Euro-American social cultural contexts, underscoring the seemingly intractable universalist relativist dilemma that plagues so many discussions of human rights. And it was, in fact, the innovative response to this perennial debate offered by Vincent Adams, one of our speakers today, that prompted the organizing committee to place the notion of bodies of evidence at the center of our symposium. In her article, Suffering the Winds of Lhasa, Adams urges us to hold on to the universalist claim that so powerfully authorizes human rights, while simultaneously rethinking the very category of the universal. And she does this ethnographically by attending to the actual bodies of Tibetans, who all too often are abstracted out of discussions that focus on questions of justice and international law. Analyzing the ways in which first-hand accounts of suffering by Tibetans create a sense of empathy, Adams argues that this identification rests in part on an idea of a universal body. This is a view that we all have bodies that share basic needs and that suffer similarly from pain, torture, abuse, neglect, and so on. Yet Adams reminds us that most Western supporters of the Tibetan cause read an account, say by a nun who was tortured by electric shocks, as an account of her individual body, and then experience the abuses to that body as an offense to all bodies everywhere, which have rights to dignity by the very fact of being human. But Tibetans listening to the account of the nun would not necessarily understand the nun's suffering as individualized or as only individualized, since Tibetans tend to view the body as bound up with past and present bodies in a social field that gives rise to physical form. So the person in Tibet is not just a collective body or the product of accumulated karma, but also partakes of various spirit entities who may attach to the person. Adams contends that these particular very particular Tibetan cultural understandings, which reject dualism such as body-mind and collective-individual, may paradoxically offer the basis for a more universal human rights framework, one that doesn't replicate this collective-individual binary, but rather supersedes it. So Adams proposes a way to think the very categories of the human rights debate in a way that still makes the voices and bodies of the suffering central. As Adams and many others have observed, the figure of the universal body that populates much human rights discourse and imagery abstracts suffering out from particular historical and cultural contexts, producing a generic or aggregate victim for whom others, whether it's humanitarian aid workers, doctors, or scholars, then speak and must speak. These are the suffering strangers identified by Leslie Butt, or the speechless emissaries described by Lisa Malky, human rights victims depicted usually in the visual form of photographs as representatives of bare, naked man, or part of an indistinguishable mass of humanity, although it's often still a racialized and gendered mass. Such representations work hand in hand with bureaucratic procedures of human rights work that transform individual experiences of suffering into what Erica James, working in Haiti, has called portfolios of suffering that dehistoricize individual experience, even as they become currency in the humanitarian market. Likewise, in her ethnographic work with Hutu refugees in Tanzania, Lisa Malky was struck by the fact that the extensive documentary evidence accumulated by humanitarian aid workers featured very little testimony from the refugees themselves. Rather, in that instance, bodies constituted the key form of evidence for doctors and others working with the refugees. For those humanitarian personnel trying to determine who was a genuine refugee, and a genuine human rights victim, wounds and other marks of violence spoke louder than words. The physical body thus became a more reliable archive of suffering than first-hand testimony. In some contexts, too, the body has become the only resource that marginalized populations have in their quest for humanitarian assistance, refracting disturbing new forms of biological citizenship that may compel desperate individuals to injure or infect themselves in order, paradoxically, to be acknowledged as humans who are rights bearers. This reminds us that stressing the centrality of the body in conceptualizations of human rights has a dark or dangerous side, as we also know from the ways in which memories of violence and death may be harnessed to divisive and even destructive memory politics. As the work of Catherine Verdery and many others have made clear, the political lives, and I would add afterlives, of dead bodies are long and unpredictable. The seeming obviousness and naturalness of the body as a text to be read belies the fact that such readings are also translations, and one in which doctors and others, including the entrepreneurs of memory politics, assume ever greater authority in bearing witness. Even new technologies that threaten to supplant the very figure of the witness itself, such as the innovative DNA testing that was employed to identify victims at Srebrenica in Bosnia, nonetheless entail complex layers of cultural and social negotiation and reading. At Srebrenica, for instance, teams of interviewers and researchers worked with victims' families to obtain DNA samples and to come to consensus on the identities of the men killed in that 1995 massacre. In different ways, speakers today will analyze the multiple translations necessary to render bodies as evidence. By way of closing, I would just urge all of us today to pay close attention to the registers in which such translations occur and the forms of evidence that scholars and others employ. In translating the experience of human rights violations to larger audiences, there is a frequent reliance on the visual mode. And this privileging of the visual is not new to the digital age, though it may be heightened today. To offer just one example, we can think about the power of visual imagery in the mobilizations over a century ago around the atrocities in the Belgian Congo. In her work on mass rapes in the Congo, both in the colonial and post-colonial eras, Nancy Hunt, one of our participants today, has refocused her attention from optics to acoustics, aiming to listen to distress in its immediacy. She further encourages us to think about other senses, such as smell, the forms of testimony they may provide, and how we as scholars may recover and analyze those experiences in ways that restore agency to those who experience them in the first person. Like those of Adams, Hunt's suggestions point us towards new engagements with the corporeal that retain the centrality of the body in human rights discourse and practice, but that move us away from the vision of a universal body for which others speak and whose cultural historical specificity is lost. So with that, I thank all of you again, and I look forward to today's discussions. Thank you very much.